go ahead and get started. It's 3:01, so that seems fair. Just like last time, what I'm going to do is get started in the CED, but I just want to kind of just say a couple things before we kind of get to that point. So I just want to say that these are a minimum, right? So I don't want anyone thinking that this is it. This is like the review. This is we're going to touch on everything important in Unit 3 real quick. And that's it, though. We're just touching on. We're not going into a lot of depth. Everything that you'll see here is tied directly to the CED, but that doesn't mean it's all the information you need to know. That's why I provide all this other stuff on the resource pages on the class website. So the only point I'm trying to say here is the more you can do to be prepared, the better. So I don't want you to just think that this is kind of solely enough. As I've done before, and you'll get used to throughout this year, I will continue using the SPICE T chart throughout. This unit's kind of funny because it really only uses two of the themes, being political and cultural, so the P and the C. But in Unit 4, we'll be making a much wider use of things. So as I did in Unit 2 and Unit 1, I'll start with just kind of going over the geography, saying where we're talking about in the world to make sure everyone has an understanding of what we're talking about. So these here are the gunpowder empires. I guess I should have said that back here. So these are the gunpowder empires, and you'll kind of hear that phrase if you've watched the videos that I've posted. You've heard the word gunpowder empires mentioned, quite a bit of the phrase gunpowder empires mentioned. If you've read in the textbook, you've seen it. If you've looked in the slides, you've seen it. So hopefully by now you're aware of this idea that there were these three empires we call the gunpowder empires. They were called that because they used gunpowder. Surprise. They weren't the only ones, but they made very large land-based empires very quickly on the basis of its use. So that's where that comes from. So this is a map here that shows you the three of them being the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Mughal. This does also show the Manchu or Qing dynasty, Manchu Empire, and the Russian Empire. But that makes sense because they're sharing the same kind of part of the world here. One thing I like is that this map also shows you how these empires changed over time. So the map you're looking at here shows you 1700. But if you look at the lines, this will show you where there was movement in the Ottoman Empire up here, in the Russian Empire over here into Eastern Europe, also into Central Asia and even into Eastern Asia to an extent. The Manchu Empire, the Qing dynasty, expanded hugely into Central Europe or Central Asia rather, and then you can see here the Safavids moved into kind of Central Asia there in the Middle East a bit over here, even getting as far into Turkey at different points. So anyway, so that shows you, some of that change over time. These all didn't happen at the same time. That's why you can kind of see the different time frames here. Oh, sorry, that actually shows you the retreat. So that's I said that backwards. Sorry. So this was where that boundary was at 1514, and then at 1700, the Ottomans had taken over that. So they did have that territory into Anatolia, but the Ottomans ended up taking that back by 1700. So that shows you that change there. The next group we'll talk about are the Americas and Africa, just because there's only a few of them, so we'll kind of lump them together. The Freeman map does a pretty good job showing you where they are. So the Aztec or the Mexica or the Mexica were in Mexico. You might notice those words sound familiar. The Inca were in South America along the west coast of South America in the Andes Mountains, and the Songhai were in Western Africa, Sub-Saharan Western Africa. Russia and China will be the ones we'll talk about next, and then I actually do talk about Europe a little bit as well. Some of the stuff I'll say is repeating a little bit what we did in class, but it's usually a little bit more condensed here. But I'm kind of providing it this way so all of this information is together in one place, so you're not having to go to 4 or 5 different places to get this review stuff. So that's, it is all going to be here, so I apologize when there is some repetition. But this shows you the kind of borders of the Ming Dynasty, which is in the orange, and then the Qing Dynasty and how that growth was. Remember, the Qing Dynasty at its largest extent was the largest that the Chinese Empire, whatever you want to call it, that's the largest it ever was. Okay, so it never got larger than it did under Qing control. You can see during this time as well, Korea and Vietnam were considered vassal states. They were basically under the Qing sphere of influence at this time. In terms of Russia, this map you've seen before, so this is kind of Russia at the kind of the middle of the 1950s, kind of just after, not just after, but after the expansion that took place under Ivan the Great. Okay, and then you can see the gray area is the next level of expansion over the next 150 years, where they took over most of Siberia and also spread south into Central Asia / kind of very southeastern or Europe, you might even call that, in the Caucasus there in the middle over here. Anyway, and that's the expansion beyond there. This is kind of to the end of our period, so we'll learn about all of this stuff in the next period of time, but the red area is the kind of larger kind of edge of where we'd be looking at, getting towards, well, actually, no, that's through the end of Peter the Great's rule. So this would be through Peter the Great's rules in the red. And we're going to talk about all these people later, but I just want to give you this context so we can kind of have a better understanding when we get there. So I'm not going to show you as many of these, but this is just the highlights. So in the year 1000, we've got the Kievan Rus as a major power. We've got the Byzantine Empire as a major power. Iberia is under Al-Andalus, meaning it's under Muslim control at this point still. The Holy Roman Empire is going strong there in the middle, as you see. And France, has some power, but it's not as big as it'll be. But the big changes you're going to see are going to be to the east of Europe, to the southeast of Europe, and Spain, as you'll see, and then Central Europe eventually. So you can see all that change. This is the influx of that Mongol Empire that kind of brings us to the start of our period now in this time frame in 1450. So now Russia's under the control of the Mongols. The Ottoman Empire controls almost all of what was the Byzantine territory by this point. So you can see how quickly that happens. It does still exist, the Byzantine Empire, for 3 more years, but it's pretty much over at this point. You'll also notice that now Spain is mostly under Catholic control. I'm sorry, I'll try not to get that close to that. But the only area that was under Muslim control is Granada, in the southern part. You can see France is sort of consolidating its power. Central Europe's starting to actually fracture a little bit. So in the last map, the Holy Roman Empire controlled much more. Now you've got a few other groups that are starting to kind of exert their influence as well. By 1750, by the end of our period, you can see how things have changed once again substantially. So now the Mongols are gone. The Russian Empire has taken over basically all of that territory. The Ottoman Empire has expanded into the southern part of that Mongol territory for now, but that will change pretty quickly. That's the Russians beginning to kind of push them out and take over in through here in Eastern Europe. You have the emergence of the Prussian Empire, which will really be a discussion for our next part in time, but it's good to know by the end of this period in time is when they've appeared. And you have the complete breakdown or complete fracturing of Central Europe because of the Reformation and a few different wars that went on that just really tore this part of the world apart. At the same time, you can see that in the far west of Europe, Portugal, Spain, France, and Great Britain are basically what they are today. So in some ways, the modern world in which we live has started to take root by now, or to take form by now, but in some ways we're still very far removed from that. So now I'm going to go through the topic pages, at least the first 3 topics, and then we'll do topic 3.4 in part 3. So just like last time, I include these pages here, but I don't want to go through this line by line. What I am going to do, though, in each of these is basically answer the question that's posed by the learning objective. So we'll do that in a second. But as you've seen a few times and should be familiar to you by now, everything that's kind of key terms or key concepts from this is present on the SPICE-T chart. And here it is, the area that's highlighted in yellow is what we're looking at. Okay, so really what we're doing, like I said, to begin with, is just going to answer the question. So why did land-based empires expand between 1450 and 1750? Well, one big reason was the advent of better weapons, particularly gunpowder. That's why we have the gunpowder empires. And then the things that gunpowder enabled, so things like cannons and some of the early guns. Arbusks, I think, is one of the types, but there's a few different kinds that emerged during this time. And so that led to more conflict, but it also allowed the powers that be then to consolidate power because they would have access to this technology and control of this technology in a way that gave them an advantage over others. We're going to talk about the Songhai and Moroccans again, and that's a fantastic example of what we mean by what that advantage really was. They also expanded because they were competing with each other. They were competing for resources, and they were competing for territory. This actually led to arms trade, so trade involving a military element basically for protection because you had so many different groups fighting each other and competing with each other. Some of this competition kind of then led into rivalries, really political and religious rivalries between different groups, and that then drives interregional conflict. Okay, so I just showed you in Central Europe what we were talking about there, about the kind of just complete breakdown of the Holy Roman Empire and the fracturing of that into many different parts. The Sunni-Shia conflict is another example that was a very big part of what was going on in the gunpowder empires, as we're going to talk about. So those rivalries were another reason the empires were expanding, because they were trying to outcompete each other. They were trying to outcompete their rivals. In the religious example, they were trying to do best by God. At least some of them were. And so that was a huge driver, of course, for I guess, motivation for what they were doing. I went the wrong way. Sorry about that. So I'm going to continue the use of these timelines because I think that they're a good way to just kind of run down things really quickly. So again, I'm going to step outside of our time frame a little bit just to provide context. But understand in Mesoamerica, the Maya were the first ones. They're well before all of this time. So they're even before the class starts. But we do mention them because they're the big one that was kind of existed before we get to the Aztec and later groups. So that's why we do mention them. But kind of sometime during the 12th century, we don't really know when exactly. But during the 12th century is when the Inca kind of settled down and started developing their capital city of Cusco. Remember, they stay there for a while. Shortly thereafter, so within probably 100 years of that, is when the Mexico or the Mexica settle down in central Mexico and create their capital at Tenochtitlan. Okay? So that's pretty quick. I mean, so their capital's quite a bit later. But they move into the region only about 100 years later. And then, like I said, I guess that's, 80-ish years later is when they established their capital. So that was a fair bit later. But the point I'm trying to make here is that you have these two things happening in a pretty similar time frame. A lot of times we learn these as Maya, Aztec, Inca, so we get this idea that they're kind of sequential things, and they're not really. Okay, so like I said, in a sense, the Inca are before the Mexica, but not even really, because they existed. They just didn't live in this area. They actually moved into this area. But anyway, 1325, when they create their capital, about 100 years after that, just over 100 years after that, is when the Inca started expanding. So like I said, they stayed pretty close to their capital for a while. Around the same time, of course, is when the Spanish arrived in both places in the kind of early to mid, I guess it's really just the early 16th century. And then shortly thereafter, the Spanish conquer both of these empires. Okay, so that's kind of the track for both of them. So this is what you should kind of know at the highest level possible, the overview. Like I said, they settle in central Mexico, the Mexica here, which are the Aztec. They found their capital city, which was Tenochtitlan, which today is Mexico City. At the time, there was another group that was the dominant power in the region, and in fact, they kind of expelled the Mexica a couple times, so that they kind of had to leave and come back and move around because they weren't really welcomed in this region. By 1428, they had allied with two other groups in the region to defeat the group that was in charge, and that's really when the Aztec Empire gets started. So up until this point, they're really just a city. They're really just a powerful city, or becoming a powerful city. But in 1428 is when they become the Aztec Empire, because they have that triple alliance, and they take over, essentially. They use theocratic governments, so that they believe that their leaders were divinely inspired or divinely influenced, and they used human sacrifice to legitimize their rule. They also have these things called tribute lists, which is what they use to fund their empire. I'm saying these things in a very summary way now because we're going to get into detail in them later. Like I said before, they're conquered by the Spanish in the early 16th century. And it's not just the Spanish, by the way. As you might imagine, they took control over a lot of Mexico in this time frame here. And as may not surprise you, they made some enemies along the way. And so when the Spanish arrived and wanted to fight them, they had some friends in the battle, basically. So there were some ready enemies ready to go that wanted to fight the Aztec because the Aztec had been taking people for human sacrifice, demanding tribute, that kind of stuff, for a long period of time at this point. So it wasn't just the Spanish, they had help. The Inca, like I said before, settled actually slightly earlier than the Mexica did, but they actually were pretty stationary. They didn't spread until after the Aztec really did, so it's kind of funny. At least not in a large way, but they end up taking over a larger area. So they start expanding in the 1440s, end up taking over kind of most of the western coast of South America. That's the Andes Mountains, like I said before. So it's a very difficult terrain to live in. They used monumental architecture, things like the Sun Temple at Cusco and Machu Picchu, to legitimize their rule. Essentially, they built these grand, amazing, that we still can't really understand how they built some of these things truly, structures. And that had the impact of, inspiring awe and making people want to follow them. They also had a centralized bureaucracy. They divided their empire into four. Their name actually meant the land of the four corners, I think it was. But anyway, they divided the empire into four. They also had a system of they had taxation as well. Not in the same way that they had the tribute list, but they did tax goods. So essentially, people had to provide products to the empire, but they also had this forced labor system called the Mita, which was a forced labor taxation system. Essentially, this is how they built a lot of the stuff, at least in theory. Certainly their road system, they used the labor force of their empire. That was one of the ways they paid tax, was through their effort. Like I said, they did build that complex road system pretty much the entire way, which allowed the empire to be connected, and also, it's just, again, from a legitimacy standpoint, grand infrastructure like that is also just like architecture would have that awe-inspiring, hey, these people should be in charge, kind of influence. And they're also pretty impressive just for their high altitude and terrace structures that they built. Like I said, Machu Picchu, you probably saw photos of that in World War, or at least in life, you've probably seen them. But it was very impressive. We're talking about in elevations up above Denver, so they're very high elevations that they were building in. So it was very impressive stuff. They were conquered by the Spanish as well, slightly after the Aztec were, and it took a little bit longer. There were some pockets of resistance, one in particular that persisted all the way until 1572, but by 1572 all of this was under Spanish control. Same rundown for West Africa. By now a lot of these things should be very familiar to you. So the Kingdom of Ghana was where we start when we're talking about West Africa, but by 1240 that's fully absorbed into the Kingdom of Mali. Mansa Musa is someone you should know. He made his famous Hajj to Mecca in 1325. In 1464 is really when the Songhai starts spreading. Shortly thereafter is when they absorb Timbuktu into the empire and enter their own golden age. In 1493, power changes within the empire and it is divided into four. By 1500, they've absorbed most of the Songhai Empire, but then they enter this period of decline. They end up having conflict with the Moroccans. And by 1600, the Songhai is no more. Then once we get into the 17th century and then the 18th century, you have, well, first of all, in the 17th century, you have West Africa kind of fragmented into many states. And that's when the Atlantic slave trade begins, so that becomes a major economic driver in this region at this point. And then you also have, and like I said, in the 18th century is when European exploration and colonization of Western Africa really begins. And that's what we'll talk about in the next part of the class. So Songhai, despite spreading from 1464, was around quite a bit before then. Okay, so they actually were around from about the 10th century, at some point during that time. They existed kind of between where we would have said Timbuktu and Mali was, and the Hausa kingdoms in kind of more central Africa. It's still west, but it's like toward the middle of Africa is where the Hausa were. So they were between the two of those, okay? Like I said, 1464 is when they started expanding. They ended up conquering in both directions, taking over all of this and taking over the gold and salt mines. Remember, that was very crucial to the entire well-being of this region, okay? That was the economic driver of West Africa at this point in time, was their gold and salt trade, because they had gold and salt mines all through this region. By 1600, though, that empire had completely collapsed. So this happened so quickly, right? Like I said, yes, they were around for a while before then, but they don't really, I don't want to say matter because that sounds terrible, but what I'm saying is they're not an empire until 1464. And from 1464 to 1600, they go from not particularly important to the largest empire that's ever existed in African history to no longer existing in 140 years. So it was a very quick change and a very rapid expansion that they went through. You need to know about the conflict that they had with the Moroccans. So Askia Muhammad, the name you see there, took control in 1493. And Askia Muhammad actually means Muhammad the usurper. He took power from a different family that was in charge. And so he completely changed the way that the empire, or the kingdom, or empire, whatever you want to call it, was run. He divided into administrative divisions, and some of this was liked by the people, some of it wasn't. But ultimately, what ends up happening is in 1529. So, like I said, he takes over in 1493. In 1529, one of his sons takes power. It was a bloodless coup. It wasn't violent. But one of his sons takes power and wants to change the direction in which things are going. But that didn't prove very very popular. And just a couple years later, he was assassinated in 1531. And so what really happened was you had this period of decline that started. You had civil war, you had instability, and so the Songhai just weren't really flourishing. Remember, from 1464 up until this point, they were growing rapidly. Okay, they were rapidly expanding, taking over the gold and salt trade, becoming wealthy, creating a pretty sophisticated bureaucracy as well. And then all of a sudden, that just comes to a stop, basically, and everyone starts fighting. You have chaos, decline, and so one big problem that this created was they weren't really doing a very good job then controlling the gold and salt trade, because they had all of this internal problem, all these internal problems, they had all this strife. So Morocco basically decided that they needed to take over all of this. Now, of course, they also wanted to take this over because it was a source of tremendous wealth and power, but it wasn't like it was only that, okay? That wasn't the only reason. Part of the reason they wanted to take it over was because no one was really in charge, and that was creating other problems for the supply in a larger sense. And they needed these things as well. So they initially try in 1556 to take over. They were unsuccessful, but there was just continual conflict from that point onward, basically, until 1591. In 1591, Moroccan forces invade the Songhai Empire, full stop, and take it over, basically. I mean, they don't retain power, but they defeat the army and they defeat the government, and the government is no more. Now, what's important to understand here, and this is what I alluded to earlier, was the Songhai army was way larger than the Moroccan forces. But the Moroccan forces had gunpowder, and that changed things quite a bit. So the reason that they didn't end up, this all wasn't Morocco. Like if you look, this is 1600, right? So the idea is here's in the year 1600, Morocco controlled all the way down into here and basically had taken over the Songhai Empire. Remember, Mali still exists until 1670. So they were kind of pushed down here, but they still were there, but they just weren't a major power. Anyway, shortly after this, so this is 1600, by 1603, I'll just wait for my bar to disappear. By 1603, the dynasty that was in control, I should say Saadi, by the way, not Saad, it was a typo. The dynasty that was in control of Morocco entered its own period of civil war. What am I doing? Sorry. Entered its own period of civil war and decline. So that's why that didn't stay under the control of the Moroccans. It just basically fractures into a whole bunch of states, and then, like I said, eventually the Europeans kind of move in and end up exploring and colonizing and We'll learn about that in the next part. So the Ottoman Empire, now I'm going to move into the gunpowder empires. These ones you should know the most about, so hopefully this is definitely the most review, at least the one you did. But here's kind of the rundown for them. So in the kind of 1240s, 1242 is when the Mongol Empire started their conquest into the Anatolian Peninsula. When I say the Anatolian Peninsula, that means Turkey, basically. Okay, so modern-day Turkey. In 1246, you have the kind of last major Seljuk Empire or Sultanate kind of start fragmenting. It gets divided into three and then rapidly declines from that period onward. You should recognize that word, though. You should recognize Seljuks as one of the major groups. It was a powerful power broker, so to speak, in that previous section, in the 1250 to 1450 time period that we talked about in part one. So around 1300 is when the Ottomans really start appearing on the scene. Their official start date's 1299, but no one really has any reason for that to be the true date. Like, there's no historical basis for that other than it just being set as the year that they started. But what we do know is that by 1302, they were definitely a thing, and they, under their leader Osman I, had their first major victory against the Byzantines. Now, it was just a victory. It didn't mean the Byzantines were turned away. It didn't mean the Byzantines were in rapid decline or anything like that. But it was their first. It was the first time that they had kind of had that pushback against. You can see, though, how quickly that tide changed then, because then by 1329, the Ottoman. So understand what happens here, by the way. So pretty much in any one of these conflicts we're talking about, I'll always mention the kind of first thing that changed. Not always, but I'll usually mention the first thing that changed, because that's a turning point. That's the point at which the Turkic people that were indigenous to this area that didn't want the Byzantines in control anymore started believing that they could change things, started believing that new leadership was possible. And so by 1329, there was enough support that army had grown. It's not like it was the same group of people. By 1329, it's a much larger group. And they defeat the Byzantine army, which decides to leave Anatolia for good and never tries to take back control of anything in Anatolia after that point. In 1335 is when the Ilkhanate collapsed. So this is very quick after this point. So understand where the Ottomans are in this. They're sitting between the Byzantine Empire, which is to their west, and the Mongol Ilkhanate, which is to their east. So they're between the two of these. So on the one hand, they're pushing the Byzantines out, and on the other side, the Ilkhanate collapses on its own. And so that side of Anatolia just fragments into many states. Those states then slowly get basically absorbed into the Ottoman Empire and conquered by the Ottoman Empire as it grows. In 1453, so just over 100 years after that, is when the Ottomans conquer Constantinople, and that's the end of the Byzantine Empire. So how quickly did that happen? 150 years from that first victory to that empire doesn't exist anymore, and in fact the Roman Empire doesn't exist anymore. 70 years later is when Suleiman the Magnificent took power. We're going to talk about him in a second. By the 1540s, you have Ottoman forces controlling significant parts of Europe when they moved up into Hungary. But by the 17th century, late 17th century, the tide had kind of changed, and you had the Turks fighting the Europeans and the Russians at the same time. And by the end of that war, they had lost significant territory to the north and were kind of pushed back down into Turkey, which brings us, back toward the world, the modern world in which we're living today. So this shows you that expansion, though, okay? And they were at their largest extent right at the end of the 17th century. So that's when that fighting kind of happened, and then that's when they get pushed out of here, they get pushed out of here, and then eventually get pushed out of here as well. Sorry. So that's that pushback out of Europe and out of Russia, basically. Okay, so that's how that would happen. So the Ottoman Empire, like I said, starts around the year 1300. They were the longest ruling gunpowder empire and the westernmost of them. They nearly collapsed right at the start, though. So they started expanding after the Ilkhanate collapse, like I said. But then in 1401, Timurid forces moved in, and we're going to talk about them in a second, because I kind of haven't talked about them because they didn't fit into anywhere too neatly, but I'm going to talk about them now. So they move in and actually hand the Ottomans a significant defeat in 1401 to the point of almost destroying them entirely. In the 1440s, though, they started expanding again. Like I said, in 1453 is when they conquered Constantinople. So that really underscores how quickly things were changing. Because, like I said, it was a pretty tight time frame anyway. But then you have this period of 40 years in the middle where they almost disappeared. They ended up controlling pretty much all of southwestern Asia, almost all of North Africa except Morocco, and big parts of southeastern Europe. We're talking about Greece and into the Balkans and into Hungary by 1556. They had a system of bureaucracy called devshirme that they used to legitimize their rule, and they also had a system of tax farming that they used to fund their growing empire. They existed until 1922, although obviously as they start getting pushed out of Europe and start getting pushed out of the Caucasus, their power, and they start getting pushed out of kind of Persia and the Middle East, I guess I would say, yeah. Their empire shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, but it did exist until the 1900s. So again, I always like to point these things out because we're getting to the modern world. That's why it's interesting. So Suleiman the Magnificent, he was Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, as you see there, from 1520 to 1566. When he took power, they had expanded quite a bit. I mean, they controlled pretty much all of Greece. They controlled pretty much all of Egypt and the Holy Lands, big parts of Saudi Arabia, or at least the coasts of Saudi Arabia. They controlled, or the Arabian Peninsula. Anyway, my point is, they were pretty large by then, but he continued the conquering. He continued their expansion into further parts of North Africa, basically connected the empire in North Africa, and then into the Middle East and into Persia as well. It didn't reach its biggest size until 1683, so it kept growing after his reign, but his rule was associated with his legal code. I don't know which last. Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, his legal code, which lasted 300 years. Sorry, I misread that. So, yeah, so his legal code stayed the Ottoman legal code for, like I said, they were there until the 1900s. He was in charge until 1566. So, my point is, his legal code was the legal code for almost the entire Ottoman Empire. He also ruled over what was considered a cultural golden age for the Ottoman Empire as well. So I always like to point out these golden ages. That's just a period of particular prosperity for the empire that we're talking about. He renovated a lot of the holy sites that we would talk about in the Holy Lands today, places like the old wall in Jerusalem. So I don't know if you know what I'm talking about when I say the old wall in Jerusalem. The wall that's there today is the wall that he built, or rebuilt rather. So that's still that wall today. He also did major renovations in the Dome of the Rock and a couple other sites. He did renovations in the Kaaba in Mecca. So it wasn't just in Jerusalem. So it wasn't, it was for all of the Abrahamic religions, he had a significant influence on their holy sites. So Persia, I'll do the same rundown. So the Safavids are who we're going to talk about mostly here. And what you need to understand is that they were a family, basically, that moved out of Iran, moved out of Persia, to Azerbaijan, which is it's to the northwest of Persia, northwest of Iran. They moved in the 11th century, but they're going to end up kind of moving back in and becoming very important. In 1467 is when the Timurid Empire was defeated in Persia. Now, it wasn't defeated by the Safavids. It was actually defeated by a Sunni alliance, basically, of Persian and Turkish peoples that wanted to basically get rid of this quasi-Mongol group that was in charge and kind of reinstate their own rule. Shortly thereafter is when the Safavid dynasty starts, so you can see it was only about 34 years later is when they started. They really just start, though, in Azerbaijan, so this is, like I said, to the northwest of Iran or northwest of Persia. I'll show you on a map here in a second. But so they start from there and then expand and really pretty quickly, within 10 years, have control over all of Iran, all of Iraq, and they start spreading into Central Asia as well. You should know just that their golden age was, like I said, about 1587. There is when their golden age begins. I just like to point these things out. So that's when they're really at their height. But just like how I talked about how the Ottomans had pressure from multiple sides. It's even more true for the Safavids, and you'll see once I kind of show you a few maps and talk about some of their history here. But they were pushed from every side, and that really contributed to their downfall. That they ended up having pressure from just about every one of their borders. So you can see in 1736 there was this kind of brief period of kind of restoration where they lost some territory basically, and they regained some territory. Then for a brief period in time, this other group, the Zand, took over, and they put the Safavids back in charge, but this was just for legitimacy. Essentially, the Safavids had been the legitimate rulers for a long time, so they put them back in charge, but by 13 years later, the Zand themselves were powerful enough to say, no, you know what, we're in charge, and by that point, the Safavids are over, okay? But really, they're kind of over by 1736 when this other group takes over. So it's not, they're basically done in 1736, but they come back for that little period in time where they're not even really in charge, but they're figureheads, basically. So this is someone you should know, and this was actually from the previous time period, but like I said, he just didn't fit in anywhere too conveniently, for me at least. If you look through the Freeman slides, you did see him and you did learn about him. But his name is Tamerlane, or Timur later is what he's going to become to be known as, and it's the Timurid Empire is who he's in charge of. He's a Mongol Turkic leader. He's of Mongol descent, but also of Turkic descent. He took control of the Chagatai Khanate. Remember, that was one of the 4 khanates that emerged after the collapse, basically, of the Mongol Empire. He saw himself as the next Genghis Khan. He wanted to restore the Mongol Empire. That's actually what his goal was. He was very efficient at taking places over and conquering, and the estimate is that his military or his forces killed 5% of the world's population at the time in which he lived. So that's crazy. That's a lot. In 1383 is when he started conquering Persia. Like I said, later on, he actually then ends up conquering a lot of the Ottoman Empire. Remember, I said in 1401 is when that first significant battle of theirs in Anatolia took place, in Ankara. And so from 1383, they controlled most of Persia. From 1401, they controlled most of Turkey, or at least the eastern part of Turkey. But then in 1467, as I said, is when that alliance of Turkic and Persian forces came together and actually drove the Timurids out of this region. They basically, they didn't end the Timurid Empire, but they significantly weakened it, and it didn't last much longer than this. I think it was like the mid-1500s, or early 1500s, they were gone. And so this shows you what that empire was, okay? So you have the Khanate of the Golden Horde up here. Remember, that was the group that was had dominance in Russia and Central Asia. Chagatai Khanate was the one that was in charge for all of Central Asia. But then he ends up taking that over and then taking this over and extending this empire all the way, like I said, into the eastern part of Turkey, through all of Iran, most of the Middle East, and even getting into India as well. Okay, and then this was the Khanate of the Great Khan. This was the actual remnants of the Mongol Empire. And this was in 1400. So after he's pushed out, or after his empire is pushed out by that alliance, which I should point out, that alliance was a Sunni alliance. Those were Sunni Muslims that did the heavy lifting there. Okay, this was a Sunni alliance, and most of this area, all of this area, was dominant Sunni Muslim. Okay. In 1501 is when the Safavids have their first victory and they conquer Azerbaijan. So that's up here. Okay. This is the region in which they conquered initially. Within 10 years, they had taken over all of this over to here. So in 10 years, they conquered, this is where Iraq is today, this is where Iran is today, this is where Afghanistan is today, this is where Pakistan is today, and this is where India is today. So they did this in very quick order, but what's more important to understand is that they were Shia Muslims, okay? And they made that the official religion of all of this area and basically forced most people to convert. And that created a lot of tension. Because just 34 years prior, Sunni forces had taken over all of this, and this whole area is Sunni Muslim. And so this really sets the stage for kind of that future conflict that we see even through this day in this part of the world between the Sunnis and the Shias. But it also created a power base for Shia Islam, because up until this point, Shia Islam existed, but it was not a dominant force anywhere. It was not the majority, really, pretty much anywhere. I think in here a little bit it was. There were like little pockets in throughout here, but the point is, now the Shia had an empire. And still to this day, most of this area is Shia Muslim. It is Iran, which is the major Shia Muslim country in the world. So that conflict created lines that are still in place today. It also created a rivalry that's still in place today, but at this point in time, that rivalry was basically between them and the Ottomans and them and the Mughals. Sorry, excuse me. So the same kind of rundown for India. At the start of our time period is when the Delhi Sultanate is in charge. You should recognize that name because we learned about them in the first unit. They're started by a Mamluk dynasty. Remember, Mamluk just means slave. So we learned about the Mamluk dynasty in Egypt. Well, India had its own Mamluk dynasty. So 1335 is when the Delhi Sultanate was at its largest size, okay? And then about 200 years later is when the Mughal Empire is founded. There's this period of time where they were conquered, actually, and almost disappeared. Just like how the Ottomans almost disappeared, the Mughals almost disappeared as well. By 1555, they're back. In 1628 is when their golden age begins. In 1674, though, is when they start seeing some fracturing. The Maratha kingdom begins at that point, and that will become a dominant force. And so that's, like I said, the kind of fracturing of their kingdom begins then. In the early 1700s is when a new emperor took charge and started reforming the government. But again, that wasn't, just like we saw with the Songhai, that ended up not being very popular. And so after his death, very shortly thereafter, this wasn't an assassination or anything like that, so it wasn't the same context. But after his death, you have this period of chaos that emerged. They had 4 emperors in 1719 as an example of how chaotic it was. And by 1793, the British East India Company has basically taken over the Mughal Empire and is basically running the Mughal Empire. And so they persist. They're still around until 1857, but from 1793, they're not really in charge. Okay, so this is the timeline for them. It's funny, actually, because I could tell a lot of these slides, my text has changed. Like, this shouldn't be off the edge, but anyway, I'll figure that out later. So I apologize for the appearance here. So you should know about Babur. He was a descendant of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane. So he on one side was a descendant of Genghis Khan, and the other side was a descendant of Tamerlane. That's why sometimes you'll hear the Mughal Empire referred to as the Mongol Empire for India, because it did have that Mongol lineage kind of in its background. They won their first decisive victory against the Delhi Sultanate in 1526, and that's really the beginning of their empire. At the start, they're just up here. They're just in this area that you can see in those lines. Remember, in 1540 is when they kind of disappear. So from 1540 to 1556, the Sur dynasty, which by the way was also from this same area. So it's not like someone came in from here or came in from here or whatever. It was actually a competing group from their own area that took over for about 15 to 16 years. They actually ended up taking over all the way over to Bengal, okay, Bangladesh. And so they kind of expand, is what I'm getting at, because at the end of the 1540 period, at the end of the initial period of Mughal rule, they hadn't gotten this far. So when they take back over now, they control all the way to here. By 1605, so they take back over in 1556. By 1605, they basically control all of the northern part of the Indian subcontinent. And by 1707, they basically control all of the Indian subcontinent. But remember, just shortly thereafter is when that decline kind of begins. They were the easternmost of the gunpowder empires. So again, if we go across, it's Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal. They had an alliance with the Safavids, which is actually how they were able to fight off the Sur. But that ends up coming back to be a problem later, and they end up fighting with the Safavids later over the same issue. They're known for building mausolea and mosques to legitimize their rule, just like the other grand architecture we've talked about, and we'll see some examples of here in a second. They had a system of taxation called zamindar that they used to help fund the empire, and they begin their decline really at the start of the 18th century is when they start declining, and then, like I said, by the middle of the 19th century is when they are no more. But in that interim period, they're just really vassals of the British. You need to know about the Mughal-Safavid Wars, or the Safavid-Mughal Wars. I think you can see it both ways. They were actually two wars that took place, one in 1622 to 1623 and the other in 1649 to 1652. They were fought in modern-day Afghanistan in an area called Kandahar. That name may be familiar to you because it's an area of conflict today where we're dealing with Taliban forces and that kind of stuff. It's in this same exact part of the world. So the conflict here stemmed from the fact that when the Safavids helped the Mughals defeat the Sur, the Mughals promised them this area. They said, okay, well, if you come help us, this part of the territory, this part of our empire will be yours. So you can control this part. And then once the Mughals were in charge again, they decided they didn't really like that and that they wanted control of this area, so they took control of it. As you might imagine, that upset the Safavids. And so they invaded in 1622. They actually won very quickly, and they took control of it. They had control of it until 1638, when the person they put in charge of it, so this was the Safavid administrator, the Safavid bureaucrat. We've talked about bureaucracy quite a few times, but this is the first example we're going to point to of a bureaucrat really having some power. Because essentially, what this bureaucrat did, or what this administrator did, was just change sides. So he was running it for the Safavids and then decided to team up and become a Mughal. And so he switched his alliance, and so in 1638, the region came back under control of the Mughals because he was now a Mughal bureaucrat or a Mughal administrator. They, of course, did not like that, and so 10 years later, they sent a force, or 11 years later, they sent a force that attacked and took over again very quickly. The reason I'm highlighting that is because the reason for understanding that is that the Mughals did not have very good control of this area. They did not have very good infrastructure in this area. So they really didn't have any reason to control it. And so it was very easy for the Safavids to take this over twice. So they took it over in 1649. The Mughals did try to reconquer it multiple times but failed. And by 1653, they gave up. And the result of this is that the Safavids then got that territory and had control of that territory until they were no longer an empire. So China, we went through this the other day in class, so this should be very familiar to you. A quick rundown is that when we start the period is basically when Kublai Khan is taking over from the Song dynasty. Shortly thereafter, about 90 years later, is when the Yuan dynasty, his dynasty, is defeated by the Ming. Remember, the Ming dynasty at first are explorers. At first, they have this massive fleet, but they quickly return to isolationism. They were kind of the victim of quite a few different consequences, that some of which were beyond their control, that weakened them to the point of defeat in the early to mid 17th century, when the Manchu Empire began expanding and defeated the Ming dynasty in 1644, establishing the Qing dynasty. And remember, the Qing dynasty stays in power until 1912. Sorry, I almost read in the late 18th century is when they're at their largest size, but they actually stay in power until 1912. So the Ming dynasty had paper currency at first, ended up using metal coins. That's important to know because they had hard currency taxation, meaning they require taxes to be paid in money, not in goods. That makes a lot of sense in theory until you run out of money, which is what happened because Japan and Spain cut off their silver supply. That made it impossible for people to pay their taxes. So you add that economic instability to the fact that there was a little ice age happening, so people were starving. There was an earthquake that killed almost 1 million people, and then you have them having conflicts not only with the Manchu Empire, but also with the Japanese and Korea. And you have a recipe for decline that ended up in their defeat in 1644 when the Manchus, another group from the north, take over. But remember, they didn't really change things dramatically. Okay, they come in and basically assimilate into the Chinese culture, that they don't try to change it too substantially. They embrace Confucianism. They keep the civil service exam. They keep the elements of bureaucracy. One thing you need to know from them is that they commission these Qing imperial portraits. There's an example there that you can see, and we'll look at some examples later on. But they did this to legitimize their rule, because this was an awe-inspiring thing that was meant to show how grand their empire was. They could create these giant murals. These were very, very large murals, like whole sides of buildings, large, basically. So same rundown for Russia. Like we said before, the Kievan Rus was what was present in this area before the Mongols move in 1240. By 1259, the Khanate of the Golden Horde becomes an independent Khanate, the Kipchak Khanate. In 1325 is when Moscow became the capital of the Russian Orthodox Church, which increased its profile quite a bit. You also had the siege of Kiev by the Mongols, which didn't help Kiev's case, I guess you'd say. In 1380 is when you have, just like I said before, when I had the first example of the Ottomans really pushing back against the Byzantines. In 1380 is when you have the first example of the Russians really pushing back against the Mongols. It's about 100 years later, almost exactly 100 years later, is when the Mongols are kind of fully pushed out by Ivan the Great. He takes over in 1462, but 1480 is when they're more or less gone. By 1500, Muscovy, or the Moscow Empire, whatever you want to call it, had tripled in size. Shortly thereafter is when Ivan the Terrible took over, further expanded the Russian Empire, but set the model for future rulers like Peter the Great, who was also pretty brutal, but also wanted to modernize Russia. And then that'll bring us to Catherine the Great, who will be really the first leader we'll learn about in the next section, or part 3 of the class. So Ivan the Great became Grand Prince, like I said, in 1464. Shortly thereafter is when it's not really fair to say he defeated the Mongols. He refused to pay their tributes, but the Mongols really withdrew because they had their own problems and they couldn't control this territory anymore. So it wasn't like he defeated them in some grand way. They just could no longer control this area. But the result was really Russian independence. So then quickly from there, he triples the size of that empire. He marries a Byzantine princess to further legitimize his rule. Remember, his subjects are overwhelmingly Eastern Orthodox, so this would be a big deal to them. He saw Moscow as the third Rome, the second Rome being Constantinople. So he wanted this to become the next major city for Christianity. That was his goal. And after his death, the power and the territory of Russia just continued to grow, as we saw on that map earlier. Ivan the Terrible was his grandson, who took over at the age of 16. Initially, he was probably a pretty good ruler. He wanted to reform Russia, wanted to modernize and westernize it. Westernize just means make it more like Europe, basically. In 1555 is when he started construction of St. Basil's Cathedral that you see right there. That's an example of using architecture for legitimacy. There were multiple tragedies in his life. His mother was poisoned, stuff like that. And that likely contributed to his change from Ivan the Reformer to Ivan the Terrible. He also may have had syphilis, which probably didn't help matters very much. He earned his nickname because he was pretty brutal to his own people, and certainly to anyone that stood against him. He would just kill people without regard, basically. He created this secret police called the Oprichnina. I'm sorry, a little hard for me to say some of these words. But anyway, that model of secret police persisted through a lot of Russian history and became a model of oppression that you could still say exists today. He set the model for that kind of absolute rule, that idea that he was in charge and what he said went, and he could do whatever he wanted. And that also then becomes the model, arguably, for the rest of Russian history through today. So my point is, a lot of what is culturally, not culturally, but politically Russian. What I meant to say was like their political culture is really what I'm trying to say. But we're talking about their politics. So that their political, that political dynamic of quote unquote the strong man. So sometimes it's a strong woman, but the idea of this brutal dictator that does whatever they want and rules with an iron fist starts with him and then continues through Peter the Great, who modeled his rule on Ivan the Terrible. Like Ivan the Terrible, he took over as a child, although his mother ruled at first as regent. You should know what that word, by the way, means. Regent basically means someone that's ruling on behalf of someone else. It was usually a parent in this example. Sorry, excuse me. It's a lot of talking when I'm not used to talking as much. So. Like I said, he was also a reformer. He also wanted to modernize and westernize Russia. He traveled through Europe in 1697 on kind of a grand tour to try to just learn about Europe and learn about Western things. Sorry, I just saw a typo as I'm going through. So some of the reforms that took place under his rule, he ended arranged marriages, he ended birthright rank. In other words, he brought merit into the system, so people earn their position instead of being born into it. He also eliminated the role of patriarch from the Russian Orthodox Church. So the patriarch was that leader position. Well, now he was in charge. As I said on the timeline, he created Russia's first permanent military, and that had a pretty large impact on Russian history because, as happens with pretty much any state, when they have a large military, they decide to use it. And again, this is how they used it. So this is how they spread. Same rundown for Europe, and again, we did this in class, so I'll go through it kind of quickly. But the connection here is you have the awakening that takes place after the Crusades. So in the kind of mid-1200s, when you have this influx of information that starts coming back into Europe, you have the start of humanism and that kind of awakening in Italy that happens. The Renaissance is the rebirth of Europe in that awakening. So the connection basically is information comes in, you have humanism develop, the Renaissance happens. Around that same time is when the Renaissance kind of is really getting started. It's when the Ottoman Empire defeats the Byzantine Empire. So now the Byzantine Empire is no longer the Roman Empire. And remember that Western Europeans didn't necessarily see the Byzantine Empire as the Roman Empire, but they were the continuation of the Roman Empire. So in 1453, they're gone, and now no one is that standard bearer. No one is the Roman Empire. And so you have this rebirth of interest in Greco-Roman ideals and Greco-Roman thinking that take place at this time, because basically, in Italy, especially in Italy, they wanted to be Rome again. They wanted to recapture that glory. In 1492, you have the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, completed by Catholic forces, by the Castilians and the Aragons. In 1517 is when Martin Luther really begins the Protestant Reformation, which continues through the 1500s into the 1600s. In the late 1600s is when the scientific revolution really begins, and that gets us into the Age of Enlightenment, which is where we'll really start the next part of the class. And just a noteworthy person to know, Louis XIV in 1715 died after being the longest-serving European monarch. So again, just to show you in a very quick sense, side by side, this was that change in Europe, particularly Western Europe, between 1450 and 1750. So you can see Spain becomes Spain in this time. Okay, it's no longer segmented. France consolidates power and kind of becomes modern France. Great Britain, can't speak, consolidates power and becomes the empire it will become. Central Europe falls apart because of the Protestant Reformation and all of that competition that goes on there. Okay? And actually, at this point in time, you still have the Ottomans in a substantial kind of way getting up into Hungary and into kind of Eastern Europe. So at the end of this time period, the Ottomans are still quite present, but this will change pretty quickly. And like I said, Europe kind of pushes them out, and they get pressure from here from the Russians as well. So you should know about the Holy Roman Empire. You're going to see it kind of grow there in the GIF that's on the screen. So they start in the early Middle Ages and exist all the way through 1806. They include basically what we would say is modern-day Germany, the northern part of Italy, and then parts of the Czech Republic and France on either side. Someone you need to know from this empire is Charles V. He was the King of Spain. Okay, think about this. He was the King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor at the same time between 1519 and 1556. You might think if you're in the middle of that sandwich, that may make you uncomfortable. That's all I'm alluding to there, and we'll talk about that in a second. He also ruled, Charles V ruled over the Spanish expansion into the Americas, okay, and during the Protestant Reformation, so it was a pretty crazy time to be in charge. And this was after his rule, is when the 30 Years' War took place. So that starts in Central Europe. It really starts as a German Civil War, okay, it really just starts as a power struggle between these groups, and there's a huge influence of the Protestant Reformation here too, because that's where you had all these states kind of popping up. So in the 30 Years' War starts as a German Civil War, but eventually it becomes a war of France versus that empire that's now on either side of it, to an extent. And that's an oversimplification, by the way. It was actually a lot more complicated than that, but in a very general sense, that's what we're looking at. So the Kingdom of France was really a major power throughout this entire time. This was one of the more stable examples of a kingdom that we can point at during this entire period. Okay, so France, 987 to 1792, more or less controls most of this area. It's not to say it was the entire time, like I showed you on the map. At the start, they controlled less, but they did consolidate power and expand it over time. In 1230. Most of Iberia was controlled by these two families, the Castile and Aragons, who then formed a union in 1469 when you had the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. Okay, that should be something that you probably learned about in World War I, at least touched on a little bit, but these should be names that you know. Okay, so if any of these things are not familiar to you, this is the kind of stuff you want to study after. That union between those two lasted until 1715/1716. That's when you had the War of Spanish Succession that happened, and that basically divided the opinion between the two of them. In other words, they had differing opinions about who they wanted to side with. The Aragon actually wanted to side with the Habsburgs, which were really the group that was in charge here. Castile did not. But the end result was that Spain becomes Spain, essentially, and so now those two kingdoms are merged into one thing, which is now Spain. Like I said before, when Charles V takes over, it puts France in a pretty weird position because now they have these Habsburg kingdoms, which were Castile and Aragon, and now the Holy Roman Empire on both sides of them. Okay, so they are surrounded by a group that's not necessarily friendly to them. This leads France, who, by the way, is Catholic this entire time. France ends up siding with the Protestants in the 30 Years' War, because the Habsburgs are Catholic. And so they're trying to create one empire that's basically going to control all of this and control all of this. And France does not like that. So they end up fighting against the Catholics, even though they're Catholic, because of that political tension or that political dynamic that existed. So now we'll move on to the other sections. And all the other sections I'll say are a lot shorter. So we'll probably be wrapping up pretty quickly here. But we needed to spend all that time so you had that context about who these people were, who these groups were that we're talking about, so you want to kind of can place them in that context. So if we're looking at, let's go back real quick, sorry, if we're looking at 3.2, the real crux of the question that we're getting at here is how did leaders legitimize and consolidate power in this time. Once again, the yellow stuff you see here is the stuff from that topic page that we'll be going through in these pages. Like I said, the question we're answering is how did leaders consolidate and legitimize their power between 1450 and 1750? Let's talk about both these things. Leaders need legitimacy, which is basically the acceptance of their authority by others. And this is both internal and external, okay? It's not just their own subjects. They also need external legitimacy to be able to engage in trade and all those kind of things. In this era, leaders used bureaucracy, religion, and monumental architecture and art to increase their legitimacy. In some instances, and there was a really good example that someone basically made their case on one of the tests, that you could argue that they used technology to increase their legitimacy as well. But to be honest, I would say that the line for their technology, and particularly their military technology, is more directly aligned to their actual power, not their legitimacy. Their legitimacy is how others view them, how others see them as powerful. Now, yes, that does come from their actual tangible power, but when we're talking about legitimacy, we're more talking about the intangible. We're talking about people's willingness to look at a leader or to look at a ruler and say, yeah, they should be in charge. Like, yes, I believe that they are the rightful ruler, essentially. Now, consolidating power is essentially bringing more power underneath your umbrella. It's growing your power and strengthening your power by centralizing it over time, by pulling more and more of it under you. And the way they were able to do this was also through the use of bureaucracy, but also through things like systems of taxation, which gave them the resources they needed to be able to build these empires in the first place. You can see a cartoon that I put there, but this is pretty much true of a lot of kings' relationship with these tools of legitimacy. In other words, once you get past the divine right of kings, I'm not much into theology. In other words, I don't really believe any of this religion stuff, but as long as people see it as my legitimacy, as long as people believe that I should be the king, I'll go with it. So in terms of bureaucracy, like I said, rulers use bureaucracies to both legitimize and exercise or consolidate their power. It's used on both sides. And these are examples that the College Board wants you to know. So going back to the Ottoman system of Devshirme, that was the practice of basically kidnapping Balkan Christian children and forcing them into the Ottoman military and government bureaucracies. Usually these people converted to Islam. And the point that you should understand here is that despite them being kidnapped and that sounding terrible, these people were fiercely loyal to the Ottomans. Now, it makes sense. They were kidnapped as children. They were trained since the time they were children to be loyal to the Ottoman rulers. But the point I want to make here is that was incredibly successful. It was incredibly effective in having the kind of rule that the Ottomans wanted to have. One branch of this, or one part of their system, were the Janissaries. The Janissaries were just an elite military arm of this system that created these elite warriors that were the warriors of the Sultan. They were his force that was extremely effective and extremely loyal to him. Another example that the college would want you to know are salaried samurai. And we're going to talk more about Japan actually in Unit 4. But this was a tool of bureaucracy because multiple shogunates used these samurai to basically control Japanese society. Remember, these were warriors that were paid by the government to be out there in society. So they were paid to control society and also be a display of that power. Okay, so again, we're talking about the actual exercise of power and then also the extension of legitimacy from the people that saw this power in action. Yes, I will. Yeah, this will be posted. It won't be posted. Oh, yeah, it'll be posted to YouTube like they always have been. Cool. So rulers also use religion to legitimize their power. Some examples that you need to know are human sacrifice from the Aztecs, where they sacrificed huge numbers of people, which not only encouraged fear but also loyalty. This was, if you watched that video that I asked you guys to watch about the Aztec, you saw the remnants of this wall that they built of skulls, where they had thousands and thousands of skulls. Sorry, excuse me. And so that was a very tangible, very real example of their power that then had an influence on their subjects. You need to know about the divine right of kings. This was the idea that European kings were selected by God, and the proof of that was that they were in charge. So it's a pretty brilliant system. God must like me because I'm in charge, and how you know that that's the case is because I'm in charge. It's a very self-fulfilling kind of thing. They also use that connection to God and that connection to the divine to justify their absolute power. Remember, absolute power means they were in charge, and how whatever they said went. So whatever they said, those were the rules, and that was that. So they could be very brutal was the result. The Songhai used religion to legitimize their power when they promoted Islam throughout the entire empire. Because remember, they were taking over people that were already Muslim. So when they came in as this devout, long-term, remember, they converted to Islam in 1009. So they were Muslim before Mali was. They were Muslim, well, Ghana, the leadership really never was, or maybe toward the end a little bit. But the point is, the Songhai were bona fide. They were Muslim from the start. And so that gave them a legitimacy that they used then to extend their power over their subjects who were Muslim. As I said before, rulers also used monumental art and architecture to legitimize their power. The goal here was just to inspire awe and loyalty in their subjects. If people saw these very impressive things, they would obey. So one example you can see here was the palace at Versailles. That was in France, still is rather. And that was Louis XIV was the one who really built that, or really made it what it was. Some other examples that the College Board wants you to know are Qing imperial portraits, the Inca Sun Temple at Cusco, and the Mughal mausolea and mosques that they built throughout their empire. So here are some examples. These are some Qing imperial portraits. You can see there's a very kind of clear, distinct style to the way that they made these. And remember, these were huge, okay? Like I said, imagine like entire wall size. And so people would see these all throughout the empire, all throughout the dynasty, and would think the people that were capable of having these made probably should be in charge. This is impressive. This is surprising. These people did something great. This is the Inca Sun Temple. Now, this up here is not. This is a church that the Spaniards built. But it's built on top of the Sun Temple. This actually gives you another look at some of this construction. But remember, this was built in the 1400s. Okay, this construction is advanced stuff. A lot of these stones that you see here are basically fused together in ways that we still do not understand how they did it. So they were advanced builders, and again, it had the impact of just impressing people to the point of submission, to the point of loyalty. This is the Taj Mahal, which was built as a mausoleum of the Mughal Empire. Okay? And so this is an example, again, of grand architecture that impressed people. So lastly, rulers use systems of taxation to basically provide the resources that they needed for their empires to be able to lead and to expand. So some of the examples that the College Board wants you to know, one is the Mughal Zamindar system. That was a system of by which basically nobility had hereditary control over the right hereditary control over specific geographical areas, and then had the right to tax those areas. So sorry, I kind of read that funny. But basically, they had control over an area. Think of it almost as like a feudalism of sorts, except your only right was to take taxes from this area. And then you pay some of those taxes to the empire. But you get to keep some of them in the middle, so that's why you were incentivized to do this. Another system that had a similar result was Ottoman tax farming, where basically they auctioned off the right to collect taxes to the highest bidder. As you might imagine, the highest bidders were usually wealthy people because they could afford to be the highest bidders. And then oftentimes these tax farmers would collect sometimes up as much as 5 times as much as they were supposed to collect and pocketed the difference. So they got incredibly wealthy off this system of tax farming. As we talked about earlier, the Mexica provided a tribute list to the people that were their subjects, where they said, you have to give us all of these things. This is an example of one of those tribute lists right here. And oftentimes those lists included people because they needed bodies for the human sacrifice. And just remember, too, that the Ming hard currency taxation system was an example of one of these taxation systems that kind of didn't have the effect you would hope it did, because that shortage of hard coins created huge economic problems for the Ming Dynasty and was one of the reasons that it declined. So it's a system of taxation, but not exactly a good example thereof. All right, so now we'll go to 3.3. And in here, the question is to explain continuity and change within systems of belief during this time. We'll go through all 3 of these. So once again, this is the part of the SPICE T-chart that we'll be going through. So, we're talking about continuity and change of the belief systems that existed in this part of the world. It's in these 3 categories, and that's those 3 subparts of the topic. So the first is the second schism in Christianity. So Christianity continued to dominate Europe, but the Protestant Reformation brought some changes to Europe. The Sunni-Shia conflict intensified during this time. So you have the conflict continuing because it predates this time. So it still was a conflict, but it intensifies. That's an example of change. Another example of change is the rise of a Shia empire in the first place. Remember that the Ottoman-Safavid rivalry set some political boundaries that persist to this day. Some of those boundaries are still boundaries, more or less, that we'll see on some maps here in a second, today. And then lastly, the exchanges that took place in South Asia, particularly between Hindus and Muslims. But no worries, no worries. I'll post the video as well, so you'll be able to see the video as well, if you want to. But anyway, so the interactions between Hindus and Muslims in South Asia and India created some opportunities for syncretism. Syncretism basically just meaning the merging of cultures. And this is an example of syncretism, but it is an example of change, is Sikhism, which was a new religion that emerged in the Punjab region around 1500, and that continues to be a major world religion to this day. So first I'm going to talk through change in Europe and change in the belief systems in Europe. So remember, Western Europe is emerging out of the Dark Ages, out of the collapse of the Roman Empire around 500, and it took them from 500 to the 1300s to wake up, to kind of come out of this. And there's a few reasons why. One of them, of course, as we talked about, being the Black Death and that having a big impact on their civilization. But another big driver of change was humanism. So humanism was this idea that the individual was important and that the human should be celebrated. And this was really kind of in contrast to what the Catholic Church taught, which was that the human was not the center of things, rather God was. It was almost blasphemous in a way to put humans in that central position. So this is kind of an awakening that takes place in Europe, in Western Europe, that leads to the Italian Renaissance. That starts, like I said, there around 1350. It's not like it just starts in a day. It's roughly around the mid-1300s. And in Italy, at least, you have this renewed interest in not only the person and the individual, but also in art, in philosophy, and basically in all things Greco-Roman, meaning derived from Greece and Rome. And now at this point, by the way, you should understand, significantly influenced by Islamic culture, because a lot of this information has spent a lot of time in the Islamic world and has become Islamicized in a way. Don't worry, like I said, I'll be trying to put it on later, and it's nearly done now, so don't worry, guys. You're not going to miss much. The Northern Renaissance followed shortly thereafter. So the Northern Renaissance starts kind of in the late 15th century, the late 1400s, and that's really just the spread of the Renaissance ideas, like secularism. That's a word you should know. Basically, the idea that you can center things on non-religious principles. Sorry, excuse me. That starts spreading then, and so the continuity and change here is pretty clear. The church continues to be very important. Okay, the church is still one of the most important things in European life. But its diminished importance is an example of change. It's pretty straightforward. So this change in Europe was a shifting in the minds of Western Europeans away from the Roman Catholic Church. And that continues from the Renaissance into the Protestant Reformation, which, remember, basically kind of overlap. They're kind of the same period but different ends with some overlap in between. And this is the second great schism of Christianity. It starts in 1517 when Martin Luther posts his 95 Theses, where he openly questions the Catholic Church, and the result of this was that new religions started forming in Central Europe, new Christian religions, new forms of Christianity that we call Protestant faiths. This was the Protestant Reformation. So this change then also influenced European politics, because you had new empires forming, you had new alliances forming between these new empires, and you had new conflicts that started because of these new groups that were coming into existence and bumping into each other in Central Europe. Christianity, though, continues to be of central importance to European life, because even though people are no longer Catholic, they're still Christian. They're just now some sort of Protestant Christian. Some of them, by the way. The Catholic Church still exists and still exists. But my point is, Christianity did not go away. In fact, Christianity becomes more important because you have the Catholic counter-revolution that happens at the same time. And so the Catholic Church itself starts trying to attract new adherents at the same time as new Christian denominations are doing the same thing to groups that weren't necessarily interested in being Christian in the first place, or at least being Catholic. So the other then conflict, or religious conflict at the time, is not in Christianity, but in Islam. It's the Sunni-Shia division. Now remember, that is a continuity that existed before this point in time. But the Gunpowder Empires really intensify that. Remember, the emergence of the Safavid Empire as a Shia empire emboldened and gave the Shia faith basically a power of operation to work from, and it also upset a lot of Sunnis that had just done all the hard work of reconquering the area, and now the Shia were in charge of. So this created these kind of actual physical lines, these boundaries, that then kind of poured fuel on a fire that was a religious conflict and now became a religious and a political conflict. There was also conflict between the Safavids and the Mughals. Now that was not rooted in Sunni-Shia conflict, but it is an example of it because the Mughals were Sunni. And so just by this natural extension, this rivalry that existed is now spread from Turkey and from the western side of the Safavid Empire, the Safavid dynasty, to its eastern side into India. Sorry, excuse me. And I just wanted to show you when I've said a few times that this division, put these lines in place that are still present today. The purple area is the Safavid Empire. And so I'm about to go to a map that's going to show you where Shia Muslims are today. So remember, the purple you see here is the area that the Safavids took over and then forced them to convert to Shia Islam. Not everyone, but some people. So that's what they did, and this is now. And you might notice that the Safavid Empire, now it kind of in through here is where you saw on the last one, when we go to this last map, this in here is where that same part of the map I'm in, this is into Iraq. Iraq has a pretty large Shia population, but the center of the Shia world is Iran and Azerbaijan. And that's right here. Once again, that's right here. So when I say that they set the lines for the modern world, I really mean it. Okay, that's still the case today. And when you look at the colors, you might notice that you see a little bit more mixing of the two faiths in, well, getting into India, but this is Pakistan and Afghanistan. This is where that conflict between the Safavids and the Mughals took place. So this is that influx of Shia influence, basically, into that region. So the last part of 3.3 are the cultural exchanges that took place in Asia. They focus mostly on South Asia, but I want to also mention East Asia. Let's talk about South Asia first. What you have to understand is that the Mughal Empire was a Sunni empire that was leading over a mostly Hindu population. There were a lot of Muslims. I'm not saying that Islam wasn't important, but most people were Hindu. That was the majority religion. So they were ruling over a people that did not have the same faith that they did. This led to exchange between those two faiths, and remember, Buddhism is still kind of around to the south of India. So these faiths are then kind of bumping into each other in South Asia and continue to exchange ideas. You should know this word syncretism. Syncretism is the merging of different religions, cultures, or philosophies over time. Now, the CED and the College Board kind of position this as if to say that Sikhism is an example of syncretism. And that's not correct. That's actually offensive to Sikhs. Because basically what that says is Sikhism is just Hinduism plus Islam. And that's not true. Now, Sikhism was influenced by those faiths and does incorporate some elements of them. But it is not just a math equation of Hinduism plus Islam equals Sikhism. So don't think of it as an example of syncretism, but it's kind of close. It's getting in that direction, and that's why the College Board puts them together like that, but I want you to understand that it's actually, offensive to see that as such. In East Asia, you had a leadership change, but you still had continuity because, like I said when we talked early on here, when the Manchu Empire took over and the Qing dynasty began, they embraced Confucianism and they embraced those elements of really Han ethnic culture that the Ming dynasty continued in their rule, and that was hugely important to their success that took them all the way through the 1900s. So that's an example of both change and continuity in the same event, because you had both of those two things happening in the same event. Alright, so we only have a couple more slides here, and then we will be done, guys. So I just wanted to go through 3.4 real quick. This is the comparison in land-based empires. So this is the review unit, basically, for Unit 3. I'm going to break it into its parts. So at this point now, we've gone through the entirety of the Spice Tea chart, and we're basically just reviewing. So when we looked at the first key concept here, the thing that we're reviewing is the fact that the interconnection of the eastern and western hemispheres, made possible by transoceanic voyaging, transformed trade and had a significant social impact on the world. I want to point out that, again, I kind of don't love the wording of the CED here, because we're talking about the connection of the eastern and western hemispheres, but really the information we're touching on is more focused on that transoceanic voyaging. In other words, the world was connected. And I think that's all they're trying to say here. So don't think about this so much as like an east-west exchange. In fact, we're going to get into that in Unit 4 when we talk about the Columbian exchange. That's not really what we're talking about here. We're just talking about the inherent exchange that takes place when you have the world connected in a way that it wasn't connected before. So some examples of this would be the expansion of religions. So you have the expansion of Christianity in Europe. You have the expansion of Christianity in the Americas as the Europeans arrive there. You have the expansion of Shia Islam when you have the Safavid Empire make it the official religion and start spreading it. And you have the expansion of Sikhism as a brand new religion in South Asia. So that's the expansion of a whole bunch of new religions that can really tie their success in a lot of ways to that connection that was going on. Now, the probably biggest stretch here, I guess, would be the Shia, because that wasn't necessarily the result of all of that connection that was going on. But it is probably fair to tie that to them because you have to remember that you had all that conflict that was going on in this region between Sunni Muslim groups. You had the Timurid Empire. Before that, you had the Chagatai Khanate and the Ilkhanate. So you had these kind of different interconnected groups fighting that created the power vacuum that allowed the Safavids to take power in the first place. So it is a fair thing to point to, but it's just probably the biggest stretch. You had conflict in religions that was driven by all of this connection. Of course, the Protestant Reformation being one example of conflict, and then the Ottoman-Safavid rivalry and the Safavid-Mughal conflicts being examples of conflict in the Sunni Shia, the Muslim world. And then lastly, you had cultural exchange and syncretism that was taking place at the time. So you had the Ottoman conquest into Eastern Europe. Remember I said the Ottomans were controlling significant portions of like Hungary and parts of Eastern Europe and into the Caucasus. So there was a spread of Islamic culture into Europe from this end, whereas previously the only real influx into Europe had been happening in Spain. You also had, as I said before, syncretism in India, where you had Hindu Islam, and to a lesser extent Buddhism, all kind of bumping into each other and sharing elements of their cultures with each other and resulting in entire new cultures and entire new traditions being embraced. So the second key concept of topic 3.4 of the review topic for Unit 3 is that empires achieved increased scope and influence around the world, shaping and being shaped by the diverse populations they incorporated. So here are some examples of conflict where you had cultures influencing one another. So the Ming-Manchu conflict is a great example of that because, like I said, the Manchu take over and then more or less just embrace the culture that they just conquered. Okay, so that's an example of a diverse population shaping the people that conquered them. The conflict that was going on between the Ottomans and the Safavids, and then the Mughals and the Safavids, but it's an example of that conflict between the Sunnis and the Shias, and how you had the spread of Shia essentially taking place at this time and spreading in this kind of very confined area, but becoming the dominant force in that confined area. Another example of the kind of spread of a change in population would be the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Church. And then lastly, another example of groups shaping each other would be the Sondheim-Morocco conflict, again, just to remind you of that, because the takeaway there is that gunpowder beats size. In other words, just having the largest empire, having the largest army is no longer sufficient. Now you need technology as well to be able to compete and to be a viable, powerful empire in the world at this time. And that is it.